So here's what I wanted to discuss with you. I think there is a need to elaborate on a couple of things because it's getting a little bit hectic in the informational arena, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And I'm referring to Trump's behavior. It's just like every day, like you have a different announcement, a new announcements, a counter argumentative announcement. Like yesterday, one of my friends sent me a meme saying that India will continue purchasing oil from Russia despite US efforts to block them or to scare them with sanctions. And like literally an hour later, it's like you can see that on social media. An hour later, or like less than an hour, Trump is posting his post on his social media. I've heard that India is not going to purchase energy resources from Russia. So it's just a mess, Professor Bronner. So I think people are just in a deep need to understand what is happening and what is going on. So if we may, if you can give us a conclusion, how successful or perhaps unsuccessful was the foreign policy for US for the past 6 months in terms of the tariff war, the economical war, the conflict regulations, the relationship between the US and other nations, because they're either rebuilding themselves or reshaping themselves, or maybe we're still at the phase of destroying what was built before we can see a new system rising up. What do you make of everything that has happened since Trump became a president in the past 6 months?
You got it. Let's start it off. Or am I? Are we starting?
We're starting.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. I appreciate it as always. You ask about President Trump, and you asked me to evaluate President Trump's 6 months in office in terms of foreign policy. And I guess, first of all, before going any further, I think your audience needs, and our audience in the United States also needs, certain criteria for making judgments about what he's doing. And it seems to me that three factors come into play for President Trump. The first is unpredictability. And what that means is there's a personal arbitrariness to the decision-making process. Does he feel insulted? Does he feel flattered? How does he feel about the situation? This is in itself a rather shaky criterion to have if you're a political leader. But let me give an example. Dmitry Medvedev in the Soviet Union makes negative comments to Trump, tries to show his bluster. Trump responds by upping the ante. And actually, there are now nuclear submarines.
Yeah, that's a great point. What do you make of that? I think that social media conflict like just escalated into actually sending nuclear submarines to wherever they were located.
In and of itself, it's simply unbelievable, because what it suggests is that there is no strategy. There are only tactics in response to one another, which is the second point. With unpredictability comes a lack of strategic goals that are to be achieved, other than the fulfillment of President Trump's own personal agenda, whatever that may be, which will shift as he wishes.
You mean for him personally, not for the nation, not for the world, but correct. For him personally.
As with any authoritarian leader, I think it's fair to say that President Trump views his own personal interests as identical with those of the country, which is certainly something that critical thinkers should keep in mind. This is also a very, very dangerous situation. The third thing is, so we've got, first of all, unpredictability. Secondly, a privileging of tactics over strategy. And thirdly, one can talk about the transactional character of foreign policy. These three elements all fit into one another. So, for example, President Trump expects personal benefits from whatever decisions are being made. That's what the transaction is. Whether it's opening a golf club in Scotland, or it's a particular guarantee or invitation to open a skyscraper in the Middle East, or it's in the Emirates, or it's a desire to set up Gaza as a Riviera, he will play a role, and his benefit will be identified with the benefit of the country, for better or worse. So it's been estimated that President Trump's family has made something like $600 million, if I remember correctly.
Since the beginning of the term.
Since the beginning of the term. Now, these three elements, the tactics, the unpredictability, and the transactional character of the foreign policy, one element may be privileged over another at any given time. So for those who are doing analyses, what they have to do is link them up as they appear in any given situation. I hope that's clear. Is that clear?
Yeah, that makes sense. And it also kind of like brings up to me a point. I forgot the name of that person, but a few months ago, the Russian Federation, they used to send somebody to offer Trump some business deals. They were like literally trying to bribe him with like, let's forget about the war in Ukraine. Let's forget about democracy. And let's just make money because we have so many like natural resources and so many business opportunities that we can do together. And then it kind of like slowed down, like it disappeared from the information. So I wasn't quite sure if it like went through or something was blocked.
Disappeared may overstate the case. However, quite possibly, this element of personal standing, ego, this may take precedence, may have taken precedence over simply making money. There's, the privileging of one criterion over the others will change over time and in different situations. Whatever he, and this is the key thing, whatever he considers primary is what becomes primary.
Professor Bronner, I have to ask you that question. That actually opens a much deeper discussion. I have been trying to analyze and understand the Ukrainian case for a couple of years now. What I mean by that is I was trying to understand how a nation, a very educated nation, when the Soviet Union broke apart and Ukraine became independent, they used to have about 50 million or 52 million. I don't remember the exact number, but over 50 million of population. That's crazy demographic. And that was a very industrial country. Like they had heavy industries and they had a very educated demography. Like they had very educated people. A good amount of them had university degrees and so on and so forth. Ukraine is at a crazy good geographically location. Like they're very well situated. Just they can just literally make money off transiting goods from point A to point B, from east to west. They're educated. They had the industries. They had the industrial capacities, everything. And I was trying to analyze why have that country that I think with the Soviet Union broke apart and Ukraine became independent, they used to be in the top 10 economies of the world. Like that was a very strong economy with a very strong population. Like we just have reached 40 million population here in Canada in 2025. You know what I mean? And they had 52 million in the 90s with a very educated population with fairly young population. And I was always questioning how they have ended up with destroyed country, even without the war, even prior to the war, economically and socially and strategically, they weren't doing well. And a few conclusions that I came to after talking to many experts, after talking to ordinary people, reading articles, analytical books, making a lot of personal analysis. I have visited Ukraine myself multiple times for longer periods of time, for months. I came to simple conclusions. It's the greed. It's the lack of strategic thinking. It's the selfishness and simply avoiding building long-term institutions that will serve the country no matter who's in power and what political party is being elected. And that's precisely what West has been doing in the past 200-300 years since the technological revolution. They were building institutions to make sure that no matter who's in power, we have balanced situation, we still have democracy, we still have strategic thinking, we're still honoring freedoms of speech, movement, religion, and so on and so forth. And now it may seem like Ukraine was just first in line to something that many countries are doing now, with specifically with the case with Trump. It just looks something that we would, analyze what's happening in Ukraine. Somebody selfish coming to the power that doesn't have strategic thinking and just does whatever will, just like you mentioned, tactically potentially benefit him or his family. And he's connecting his own benefits to what country needs. How have we ended up in that situation where we just followed the bad example versus continuing the legacy that basically, I may be wrong, but basically brought West to a very successful and cherishful a couple of hundred of years?
Well, it's a big question you ask. Let me see if I can break it down a little bit. First off, historically, most important trends in a major country are international in character. In other words, if you think of the Popular Front of the 1930s, this was a general strategy. You can make a pretty good argument, or at least I think you can, that President Roosevelt's famous New Deal is the American version of the Popular Front, with its emphasis on the welfare state, defensive Republican institution, and anti-fascism. You had the same thing in France. You had a similar phenomenon working in many different countries at the same time. What we have here is a rise of, if I can say it, right-wing extremism with its various values attached: xenophobia, a kind of national egoism, the greed of major economic players, and what you mentioned, and of course the attack on democratic norms. That's the crucial element. And I don't think in that regard. I think in that regard, one has to see this as an international trend. By the same token, every government has to respond to a certain to its power standing, and this means making specific choices within a geopolitical context. Let's put it this way: I think Ukraine made a kind of blunder in the sense that it allowed itself to be identified with wanting to go into NATO and seeking the extension of NATO. This provoked President Putin. It doesn't mean that he also had to make a choice. To poke the bear doesn't mean the bear should respond by ripping off the other person's face. But it's clear that there were
a high chance that will happen, of course.
High chance that would happen, and this is something that could have been dealt with early. The second thing with regard to Ukraine is the very positive elements you mentioned: an educated populace, a strong economy,
great geographical location.
Geographical, geopolitical, and geographical location, warm water ports. All of this was shall we say, an incentive for Putin to move in, along with the old ideological desires to recreate the Soviet or perhaps even the Tsarist empire of times past. Countries can't, it's up to countries to make judgments about where they stand and relative to their enemies. And that's true in regard to making treaties, and it's also true with regard to how you conduct a war. There's a famous line from Thucydides, arguably the first historian in this history of the Peloponnesian Wars. And he has a representative of a defeated people, the Melians, say to the victorious Athenians, "The strong do what they will, and the weak suffer what they must." Now, carrying this over, what it means is if for example, dealing with Gaza, if you're losing a war, you have to respond or if you have no chance to defend yourself or to win the war, neither is a possibility, then you have to admit it. Recently, in a remarkably intelligent move, the European Union and the Arab League called upon Hamas basically to surrender power, to release hostages, and to allow an international monitor to watch borders and supervise the Gazan economy. That makes perfect sense to me. Why? Because Hamas no longer has a chance to defend its people. The only reason Hamas is hanging on is for its own purpose, for its own purposes, to keep from being tossed in the dustbin of history, not for any service it can provide its own citizens. We saw that, in fact, in the protests that took place in Gaza. In a certain way, I think the Ukrainian government has not.
Professor Bronner, I just want to stop here before we go back to Ukraine. In regards to Gaza, and in regards that if you can't win the war, it's better not to start one. And clearly, Hamas never had a chance against Israel. It might be a very naive, surface level question, but why do you think, in your opinion, they are initiating aggressive attacks on Israel, just like the 7th of October, basically a call for war that you will never win? Why would you? That bugged me for a long time. Why would you start a war, risk your own population, risk your own power position in the territory that you're controlling, for what? Like that always like just bugged me. And I just want to like finish it. I have a lot of friends and a lot of colleagues that are coming to me because I'm half Israeli, and they're always trying to poke me and criticize me for Israel's position, even though like I'm also Canadian and I have nothing to do with Israeli political groups and how they decide and what they do. Like it has nothing to do with me, but I think they just want to, like, you're just their point of connection that they can get to and criticize you because they feel that that's where they can flush their anger. Because obviously they cannot go to the Israeli government and do that to, I don't know, let's say Benjamin Netanyahu. So they just pick targets that they can pick. But and I take that. I take that because I agree that whatever happened in Gaza, it's horrible, it's genocide, and it's a lot of human beings that have suffered and still suffer. So I take that and I allow them to flush their anger, even though I have no part in it, and I totally disagree with certain things that the Israeli government is choosing and how they choose and how they act and what they do. But at the same time, my main argument is that what about the ruling class in Gaza? Why are they not concerned about the best interest of their people? Like they have, I saw those videos. They have crazy tunnels to send missiles and try and kill Israelis. They have crazy under service infrastructure with bathrooms, rooms, shelters, crazy. And it's all for military purposes. Why haven't they built shelters for civilians? Like civilians barely have any place to hide. Why have they initiated some strikes that will obviously trigger Israel to respond in a crazy way? I'm not justifying Israel, but when you're just the same thing, when you're poking the bear, you'll get a response. Why would they initiate it over and over and over and over again when we all know that they never had a chance to begin with? What's the point?
Let's take it again, certain unpack the situation.
Yeah, and maybe I'm wrong, and correct me if anywhere rationally, like, you know, I'm tilting out of.
I think no decent person can look at the Gaza, at the Gazan people and not say that they were the subject of, if you want to call it genocide, but certainly mass murder and an extermination policy. I mean, that's impossible to do, in my view.
Of course.
Now, with regard to Hamas, they know that's happening. And I think they feel themselves in a certain way. The more that the attack on citizens, on defenseless citizens occur, the more support they will get, or that Gaza will get from the international community. And they, of course, are an authoritarian force controlling Gaza. I mean, dissidents don't live long in Gaza. So in a certain way, the more citizens get smashed, the better it is for Gaza. The better it is for Hamas, because it has no opposition. It's the only political representative at the moment of the Gazan people. And in a certain way, you can see that insofar as various states have now recognized the need for a state of Palestine. What role Gaza would play in that is complicated. Most likely, it will play a subordinate role to Fatah. And so it's crucial for Hamas to present itself as the more militant representative of the Palestinians. And of course, the equally the representative of the most exploited, disenfranchised, and suffering of the Palestinians, which is the Gazan people. Now, on the other hand, or at the same time, in a certain way, Trump's policy helped lead to this. When the Abrahamic Accords were introduced, everybody saw this. Well, this may be Trump's great moment. In a certain way, it couldn't have been, and the reason is the following: by the Abrahamic Accords, I mean basically the Israel would be recognized, and Israel would also recognize the other Arab states. That was the deal. And Gaza, of course, the capital was moved from Jerusalem to Tel Aviv. And essentially, what President Trump did was align himself with the far right in Israel, because it basically cut the Palestinians out. There had previously been a proposal by King Faisal, which was the following: the Arab states would recognize Israel if Israel would agree to a Palestinian state, and we would proceed that way. That was, in the simplest terms, the structure of the deal. What we have now is Israel will recognize the Arab states. The Arab states will recognize Israel. The United States will give support to both. You'll note that foreign aid to Saudi Arabia went up after the Abrahamic Accords, just like aid to Israel. But there's no demand for a Palestinian state. So the Palestinians were essentially cut out of the deal. This put Hamas in a very difficult situation. Hamas and Fatah as well. Fatah was attacked for its weakness and its corruption and its vacillation. Hamas, meanwhile, found itself without much of a way to move forward other than through violence. Now, it sought its own international support. The Arab states that would recognize Israel were primarily Sunni. And what was done on the part of Hamas was, a year before the October attacks, it tried to make a deal for support from Iran. Iran didn't give it that support. Thus, the attack was called off a year, and then we had October 5th. There was no other way for Hamas to move, in short. It wouldn't Palestine wouldn't be recognized as a state. The United States was aligned with the far right of the Israeli regime. The cabinet of the Israeli regime, led by Prime Minister Netanyahu, was indebted to far right figures like Itamar Ben-Gvir and religious parties. So there was no hope of negotiation there. And in a certain way, I think that is part of what led Hamas to respond as it did. Was it an intelligent move? No. Well, it was an intelligent move. For its own sake, it may not have had many alternatives. And this much one can say, the primary goal of every organization is not the pursuit of principle, but simply to stay in power. And that's what it's tried to do. and it found itself following a tactic whereby its strategic goal of staying in power was only possible by sacrificing the Gazan people. That's how I see it.
Professor Bronner, what's
It's
Israel?
complicated.
I understand. It's very complicated.
They say, I'm sorry for your audience if it sounds overcomplicated, but I don't think there's any other way to talk about this.
Why do you think Israel can't recognize Palestine? What's stopping Israel from recognizing Palestine as a state? Why the two-state solution never came up to conclude itself and work out functionally? What is actually holding Israel back from recognizing Palestine as well? From, I don't know, taking the compromises that they need to take to potentially guarantee a long-term historical peace. Maybe it's a naive surface level question, but it is just, maybe it's as simple as that, to build a plan for both nations, for people from two sides to somehow come to a peaceful resolution. Or is just like, why is it impossible?
Impossible is a big word. Unlikely is I think a better explanation. First off, again, historically, I think you can take 3 or 4 different maps, beginning in 1948, going up to 1967, going up to 1980, and ultimately winding up for today. What you'd find if you look at those maps is the possibility of a Palestinian state that was congealed, that is to say, contiguous. In other words, all the cantons would be connected. That's in 48. Then it becomes split up in 67 with the war and the West Bank being taken over. Then it gets split up more.
I want to make a point here. Sorry that I'm cutting you off, but I want to make a point here because I did hear that conversation yesterday on one of the podcasts, that it's very complex to recognize Palestinian state because they're geographically split. But what about US and Hawaii state? Hawaii is split from the mainland US. Like, they're not connected by land. Why can't two separate geographically located sides be one country?
Well, I mean, one simple reason is because Hawaii was conquered by the United States. In other words, it was not a question of some other country claiming Hawaii. It was a question of Hawaiians seeking independence. This is back in the 19th century, and already moving forward, and the United States taking Hawaii from its own people and annexing it. Same thing with Puerto Rico after the Spanish-American War. That's a different situation. Spanish were willing to give up, and did give up Puerto Rico, and the United States took it after a successful war.
Can't we use the same case? Hamas would give up on Gaza and let Fatah rule the West Bank and Gaza, host an election and let Fatah rule both sides, and, I don't know, make it a Palestinian state?
Then Fatah would lose power.
Wouldn't or would?
Would.
Really?
Yeah, I think so. And certainly that was the case as the years once Fatah came into existence in its interest was not the same as Fatah, simply because it would lose its radical base. The identity of Hamas is on the left, if you like, the more extreme margin of Fatah. Thus, you see, in a way, you can see this in its charter and also in its actions and its propaganda. On the one hand, it says that it's ready for a Palestinian state. On the other hand, it wants the territory of Israel and a one-state solution. On the one hand, it's secular. On the other hand, it's Islamic. On the one hand, it speaks about the need for peace. On the other hand, it endorses violence. On the one hand, it speaks of Palestinian democracy. On the other hand, it doesn't practice it. In other words, it doesn't actually lay out what it wants. Which provides it with flexibility in responding to Hamas and the general geopolitical situation. If that makes sense, I think
it makes sense, and it makes me come to a very simple conclusion. I'll try to explain myself, not to sound too harsh or too cynical, but if a person is unhealthy because they're partying, drinking alcohol, eating unhealthy food, and not sleeping properly, maybe it's because they want to live their life that way. If Palestinians are making things so complex and they're creating by themselves double standards, and they want peace, but they lead with aggression and violence, if they want a two-state solution, but they actually want to take over the entire land that is now controlled by Israel, maybe they're just happy with that mess. Maybe happy is not the right word, but maybe they're just okay with the way it is and they just want to remain in that state.
I think that's happy is the wrong word, but in a certain way, I think they see no other alternative. And they're probably right. Because if, as I say, if an actual two-state solution were produced, I think Fatah would wind up in a far better position than Hamas. And if it's not Fatah, then it's going to be some other new organization, which leads to the following situation. We talk about what's possible and what's impossible. This is something I think your audience should be aware of, and which is hardly ever discussed when talking about a two-state solution. What about if the following occurs? If we have a two-state solution, the settlers will have to sacrifice. The settlers, religious and secular. Now, depending upon how you count, there are there's anywhere from 250,000 to 450,000 settlers who are armed. There used to be a situation in which the tacit agreement was Jew doesn't shoot on Jew. I don't think that anybody really believes that anymore. In other words, the possibility of a civil war would be real. Yeah. On the other hand, between Fatah and Hamas, there was shall we say, a Cold War simmering for decades. With a new state, could that break into the open? Yeah. In short, you may be stuck with two civil wars with the creation of the Palestinian state. And this, I think, is what made the decision by the European Union and the Arab League so intelligent. there has to be, in my view, an external monitoring system capable of sanctioning.
Exactly. That's brilliant, Professor Brown. I was just about to say that. Why, like, if it's so complex and they cannot solve it between themselves and they cannot solve it inside themselves, like Israelis, it seems like they wouldn't be able to deal with their own settlers, with their own people. They wouldn't be able to, like, I don't know, offer them a compromise, move back into the recognized territory. We'll give you like money, buy a house here, whatever. And it looks like the Palestinians wouldn't be able to work it out between themselves either, because they're trying to remain in power. But what if the international community, just like you're saying, will interfere and somehow make it work the way they think that should work? I give money to whoever wants to get money, host election in whatever way the election needs to be hosted in Palestine. Can international community somehow interfere and make it work for them if they cannot figure it out by themselves?
You said the right word, interfere. Consider it this way. You have two groups or two, I think you can say that even among the most of the populace in both states. This is a tribal, it's almost a tribal conflict ideologically between, if you like, Jews and Palestinians. And both sides would be humiliated and feel themselves repressed if an external force came in.
Yeah, that's great, but they'll stop dying and killing themselves.
Yeah, I mean, the question though is, would such an external force have legitimacy among the populace of both? I don't know. I think in this regard, the Palestinians are probably more, shall we say, open to the possibility than the Israeli state is. The two governments, I mean, that of, we can say really a neo-fascist theocratic government of Netanyahu and Hamas, the two deserve each other.
Oh, 100%.
In my view, what's tragic is that the population of Gaza
is the one that suffers.
Exactly. And any kind of negotiation, in my view, any kind of intervention from the outside must start with that assumption. And the first real step in that direction, I think, was just taken by the European Union and the Arab League.
What do you think will happen long term? Obviously, it's a frozen conflict. It's frozen from the perspective that it's not burning the way it could have burned, with civil war inside Israel, civil war inside Palestine. There are elements of conflict, like Israel and Gaza, and some terrorist attacks and some settler issues, but it's still, I call it frozen, because the amount of energy that is being held there, the amount of conflict and disagreement that is centralized in that area is just insane. What do you, and I think it's a very, how should I verbalize it? I think the situation is controlled. It's illusionally controlled. It's controlled because the US is helping Israel a lot and controlling the situation from their side. The European Union and its international legal system is somewhat controlling the situation. But at the time that we're living in now, when the world is getting more hectic, more unpredictable, like we have a war in Ukraine, we almost had a war between Pakistan and India. Like we have so many challenges and so many conflicts that are rising up right now. We can potentially have a conflict between China and Taiwan, maybe something else. I don't know. But what I'm trying to say here is if if we will have this break point in the world where United States will just be so spread, or maybe the opposite is true, maybe United States will be localized inside itself, we wouldn't have those international tools longer to sustain the situation in Israel and between Israel and Palestine. If that will happen, what do you think will happen in that territory? If they will be left alone, what will happen to the people that live there, to the system that it's not ideal, but it's somewhat maintained at this point? How do you see the future for that for that territory?
It's easy. It's usually easy for an ally to get in, to make an alliance with one side. It's very difficult to get out once you're in. America's policy since the Second World War has shown that. If you think of Vietnam, Iraq, so on. But what I think is new about the present situation is that there's been an increased tendency to understand ideology as a material interest. And what that means is usually, if you think of conflict, realists like to ignore ideological principles and concentrate on conflicting material interests. The reason is very simple. Material interests you can always compromise. You don't hear the criticisms coming out with passion if there's a compromise of material interests. On the other hand, ideological principles are very difficult to compromise. Compromising them means compromising legitimacy, compromising a nation's identity, sense of purpose, and so on. And we now have a situation, and usually the two are different. There are ideals, there are interests. There is the material, and there's the ideological. Now I'm afraid that that ideology itself is seen as a material interest. In other words, even if there were I forgot to add this, even if there were a second state, even if both sides agreed, given what the Gazans have gone through, it's going to be very, very difficult for them to, how should we say, recognize Israel. I mean, their experience, their ideological outlook, it's going to mean something to them.
Yeah, for many generations.
Yeah, for many generations. When one speaks about from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. I think that slogan will remain with many, many Gazans. Meanwhile, on the other side, if a two-state solution were arranged, the ambitions of imperialist settlers and the religious, the ultra-Orthodox community will not just vanish. I mean, they're going to still want to absorb Judea and Samaria, the biblical territories, into Israel, and annex and expand Israel into a greater Israel. That is a very tough situation for any diplomat to deal with. In other words, you're talking about basically a third column in
interfering
circumstances. Yeah. And by the way, I think there's going to be that also in a way holds for Ukraine and Russia. One of the ways you can see, I think, or you could see President Putin, shall we say, solidifying his aims was by making those comments about restoring the Soviet Empire or the old imperial empire. This turns what is a conflict, what started as more or less a conflict over Crimea, into I don't want to say a world historical conflict, but an ideological conflict that speaks to the national self-understanding of the Russian people, and on the other hand, of the Ukrainian people seeking their independence in the aftermath of repression by the communist regime and the old imperial Russian regime. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And we have shifted a little bit out of the Ukrainian situation, but that's another thing that I wanted to discuss with you.
Go back to that. That's fine.
Why President Trump haven't so far succeeded resolving that situation? He started by avoiding sanctioning Russia further. I may be wrong, but I don't think he have approved any additional military or financial aid for Ukraine except those that were pre-approved by Biden administration. So he haven't provided any aid. I think that was his compromise for Russia, for Vladimir Putin, to show like, hey, you see, I'm not helping them anymore. Let's negotiate. I'm stepping out of the conflict and turning into moderator. So he's done that.
Even worse than that, James. More missiles and drones have struck Ukraine since.
So he had more reasons to provide help and aid, but
exactly
he was restraining.
Since Trump took over, than took place before that.
Absolutely.
Right, and I mean that tells you something. I mean, as people know,
100%. Right. So we have that part. And that didn't work out. The occupation, excuse me, continued. The strikes, as you've mentioned, not just continued, but intensified. The tragedy in Ukraine has not just continued, but intensified. And I think that President Trump was trying to give Putin what he wanted. And I think he expected, Trump had some high expectations that if he will please him, he will somehow reach a deal.
I think that's true, but I also think something else. If you remember when Trump came into office, he said, I'll deal with the conflict in a day. In a day, there'll be peace.
Yeah, that's definitely a pre-election rhetoric.
I think this shows something. And what it shows is
the lack of understanding, if you're asking me.
That's certainly right. But it shows that the way he looked at the conflict was not as I just laid out. He saw it simply as transactional. It's a question of land. It's a question of investment. It's not a question of ideology at all.
And I just want to add a point here. I think Russians have done a brilliant job by continue fooling them that it is transactional, because I remember that Steve Witkoff came back to US after he had spoke with Putin. Actually, he's going now again to meet with Putin, but he came back to US, and I remember what channel that was, but he came up in TV and he said, we can solve it very simply by just giving the Russian the 5 regions that they're partially or more than half controlling and have occupied so far. And that's it. And that's the end of the war. Let's just give them back the 5 regions and they're done.
If I could say something, In other words, the way we can solve the conflict is by basically giving Russia everything it wants and letting it win. Right.
And that's it. And we're done. But,
I mean,
and then Professor Bronner, and then I was like, okay, well, now I know that Steve Witkoff just understands nothing about the conflict. And I was like, okay, that for me was a trigger point when I was like, I'm lowering my expectations because the team that is in power probably have no clue how to resolve this conflict.
I think that's exactly right. And but by the same token, there's something that's, shall we say, smart in what they're doing. Of course, Ukraine will pay for it, but basically, I think what Trump and Witkoff are now doing is they're reflecting a certain, shall we say, Ukraine fatigue that's gripping the West. More and more people say, oh, God, all we do is throw money in there. There's no possible resolution to this. Why are we wasting our time? What does it have to do with us anyway? And if I can say so, here, progressives have not built their case very well. Someone like you knows and is clear about why Ukraine is important to the West. I don't think progressives have shown that very well. They have to show it better. And they have to show that the importance of Ukraine, both for, not simply for Europe, where it's relatively clear, but for the United States, which is separated by that large Atlantic Ocean from anything that happens. That has to be shown better. I think it can be shown. I don't think it's impossible to show that. To the contrary, I see Ukraine as important for not simply Western values, but to hold authoritarian ambitions at bay, to prevent, if you like, the success of a new authoritarian bloc from forming.
100%, yeah.
And
which we can see now.
Yeah. And also on, basic questions of who is in control of crucial resources such as oil and what have you in the region.
And Professor Bronner, I just want to add on that. I 100% agree with you. And when the war in Ukraine have started, I've heard those conversations a lot in many podcasts, among a lot of experts, among a lot of people, even ordinary people had a clear understanding that this isn't just about Ukraine and Russia. This is kind of like democracy against the authoritarian regime. And if democracy will allow dictatorship to win, it's just going to give a green light to other dictatorships and other authoritarian regimes to pursue their ambitions. But that being said, that leads me to another question. I think at least half of Biden's term, the war was going on and they were helping Ukraine a lot. The government, the people, the West in general helped Ukraine a lot. I think we can clearly say that Ukraine survived the way it is right now, geographically, territorially, and financially, and in general as a country, as a state. It's thanks to the Western help, support, and aid. But that being said,
no doubt about that.
I have attended many conferences in Canada, like NATO Ukraine, Canada Ukraine, and a lot of Ukrainian officials were invited, and sometimes they were giving a word to present. And I've heard many times, I've heard that repetitively, that the help, the support, and the aid was not enough and not on time.
James, if I can say so, here is a real mistake that the Ukrainian government made, in my view. Yeah, and it's easy. I, I know, and your audience knows that I know, should know that I know, that I'm coming at this from the outside. It's much easier for me to talk than and make arguments and claims that perhaps than people inside.
That shoot the calls, of course.
Yeah. However, having said that, every conference that I've been at, every meeting that I've had with Ukrainian representatives, it's almost that they talk about give me money, give me arms, to the exclusion of everything else. You can't build a policy simply on guilt. And that's what I think the government has been doing. They've been saying to Europe, listen, you got to help us. We're being threatened and destroyed by the big bear. And the big bear threatens you to give us cash, give us guns. And it's almost like, I don't mean to be insulting, it's almost as if the government is out there begging. And you can't do that over this amount of time. People want to hear what kind of society do you want to build? How are we going to talk about the reconstruction of Ukraine? What about the corruption? I think that those young people who stood up and demanded an accounting of the corruption that's taken place, the reinsertion or the rehabilitation of the Anti-Corruption Commission. I think those people are really to be praised. I know they've been attacked as undermining the Ukrainian government in a time of war. I don't think so. I think that's exactly what you need. You need people who are brave enough and honest enough to demand that their government represent their citizens, unlike Hamas. And I think also, if I can say so from the outside, it's time for an election.
100%. I agree with that.
This argument and one of the points of discussion at MAFRA, where, as you know, I'm the president of the International Council for Diplomacy and Dialogue, USA. One of the points of discussion was this issue of an election, and some very intelligent people said, well, we can't have an election now because it's a time of war.
But Israel had an election during the war.
Exactly. And the United States has had elections at the time of war. And England had it.
Yeah, during the World War II. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, this is not an excuse. It's only an excuse if nationalist ideology gets in the way of the material interest of people in having a government that's accountable to them. And this is this business about ideology becoming a national interest, saying, well, we're at war. This is our country, as we used to say in the United States, love it or leave it. This is a very, very unfortunate and self-defeating position to take. But if one talks about fighting authoritarianism and one says one's defending democracy, you got to show it.
Yeah, you have to practically be a democracy. Yeah.
Otherwise, the entire enterprise makes no sense.
I think that's one of my main arguments when I'm having conversations with Ukrainian experts. One of my main arguments and questions and topics is that, don't you guys think that while you were fighting an authoritarian regime, you kind of turned into some sort of authoritarian regime as well. Like
one should be careful not to create an equivalence between Russia and Ukraine. That's, I think,
it's like
the case.
When we were kids and we watched those fairy tales, it's when you're fighting a monster, you need to be very cautious not to turn into that kind, right?
That's exactly right.
But if we go back to the time that the Democrats were in power and when the war in Ukraine broke, and if we can have this conversation, I just don't see an excuse why the representatives, the ruling class of Ukraine, and back in the day, the Democrats that were leading the United States couldn't have this like, if we can, I don't see an excuse why they couldn't have this conversation. And the conversation is very simple, as you laid it out. From one perspective, it's democracy fighting dictatorship, authoritarian regime, and the whole West is happy to support the democracy and avoid allowing the authoritarian regime from winning, because that will mean just a game changer for the entire world. So 100%, the whole West was on board to help Ukraine, at least not to lose this war. I'm not saying now strategically win Russia or like humiliate them in any way, but at least make sure that the world order that used to be before that wouldn't be broken. So the West had a clear understanding of that, right? And they were completely on board, providing guns, providing cash. From the other side, Ukrainians at the beginning and still have showed extremist bravery by also defending democracy and defending their state and defending their homes and defending their families and nations and their culture.
Remarkable.
Exactly. And so why couldn't they have this simple conversation? Hey guys, we're happy to give you more cash on time, more guns on time, but you begging us for money isn't enough. You crying that you're saving us and saving the democracy isn't enough. We need from you a strategic long-term project. What is Ukraine about, and what is Ukraine is going to be after you guys at least not lose the war, if not even win? Why couldn't they have this simple conversation? We're happy to give you money. We're happy to give you guns, but we need from you a straightforward project. What are you guys about, and what kind of country you're going to build and establish during the war, not just after the war? Because nothing prevents, in my opinion, I may be naive, but nothing prevents them right now during the war to build infrastructure, to host elections, to stop the corruption, to put behind the bars whoever needs to be placed behind the bars for corruption, for other crimes, etc., etc. Nothing holds them back from doing all those necessary things to establish a successful state, just as nothing holds them back from going to a restaurant while the war goes on. Why couldn't have
you quite want to say that? But point taken.
I'm dramatizing it on purpose, but it's like, if you can go to a restaurant, if you can live a normal life in Kiev, in Lviv, while you still have war in the country, if you can get married, have kids, build your house, you know what I mean? Like, why can't you then do the necessary things to build a successful state? Because Israel done so. Israel was at existential threat since they have established the state. Somehow they were capable of, planting trees, building democracy, building political parties, building social programs.
But what I think is necessary, we said that in our white paper, we need a new Yalta, basically. In Ukraine too, we're going to need, in my opinion anyway, we're going to need a degree of international intervention. I don't think that's avoidable. To, if you like, monitor borders, to allow the sanctioning of the rule of law in areas where, shall we say, authoritarian tendencies or militias manifest themselves. But in this vein, this kind of New Yalta would have to talk about security guarantees, not just for Ukraine, but also for Russia. It would have to, in some way, speak about the rebuilding, the kind of investment strategy that involves something more than Trump being allowed to build buildings, which is more or less what he has.
That is, and open golf clubs.
And I mean, it can't be Trump rebuilding the entirety of the Ukrainian infrastructure. Here again, we need to be able to criticize and to focus on the interconnection between this transactional view of international relations, the unpredictability of Trump based on his own ego, and, if you like, the lack of a strategy and the privileging of tactics. We have to get beyond that. And the analysts of, not only the analysts of Ukraine or Russia, have been remiss in this regard. But, I mean, let's face it, the leaders the leadership that's at play in this conflict, we're not talking here about President Roosevelt, Prime Minister Churchill, or even Stalin, if you want to put it this way. All of them had a relatively clear vision, strategic vision of what they wanted, for better or worse. Here, we have a situation in which even Putin, I'm not sure, knows exactly what he wants to do with Ukraine. For example, does he want to swallow all of Ukraine, or is he content with the areas he's conquered? Or, as a third alternative, does he also want areas that he hasn't conquered, such as Kherson and Kursk? There's three alternatives. He hasn't really made clear.
Yeah, they're not laying out it clearly. I agree.
Yeah. And it's very hard to mediate a policy.
I'll just make a point here. I think they're not laying it out clearly to allow for themselves flexibility and numerous amount of exit plans in front of their own population. Because if they will say, we want to conquer the entire Ukraine, and then you're only conquering 4 regions, you're a loser. You haven't achieved what you have established that you're trying to achieve, right? So I think they're trying to remain as flexible and cautious as possible. So at any given point, when they will negotiate something, they will come out and be like, oh, we have won the war.
You're not quite sure what it is you're negotiating. There's a price for the flexibility. And
I think the price is the long-term conflict.
Yeah. And it's very tough to negotiate this way. Or for, shall we say, for diplomats to enter the situation. It may be for the foreseeable future. We may see a situation in which the best option might be to freeze the conflict. I don't want to say that absolutely, but it's, shall we say, becoming more and more of a reality.
But that brings me to another point. I had this conversation with a friend of mine last week. We were talking about the situation in Canada, the economical situation that we have, because we're not doing well economically, we're not doing well socially. We have a lot of problems from immigration perspective, economical perspective, political perspective. Like, Canada is just in deep troubles now. And
Trump would say, join us, then you could have...
No, Speaking of Trump, and now and that person, he's an investor, so he has a lot of economical knowledge. So we were mainly focusing on investments and economy. Economy was the topic of that conversation, and I was trying to get for myself insights and understanding what should I do in terms of my finances and how should I plan and act accordingly. He gave me a long lecture, and obviously that was a very hard lecture for anybody, and for me especially, to understand if you don't have a general of economical understanding as the person that I had this conversation with. But at the end of this conversation, I just laid it out simply by saying, does that mean we cannot predict and plan and strategize anything until we have a new election in the United States and Trump is like finishing his term? And he said, I didn't want to say it that way, but basically, yes.
I agree with that.
Like, are we simply stuck in that limbo without an option to think, strategize, analyze, and plan accordingly up until the next election? Like we're stuck now in the next 3.5 years.
Maybe this will change in 2026 in the election. But if you have a worldview that rests on unpredictability, in other words, you have some official, a secondary official in the Russian government, contradicting the president, and the president taking this seriously to the point where he's going to move in submarines, nuclear submarines. There's something seriously wrong
because of social media text exchanges,
right? So this unpredictability, this prickliness, this inability to separate himself from the conflict and look at it with more objectivity. 2, this transactional view, what do I get? Not what does the country get? What do I get? And this third inability, because of the other 2 things, to develop a strategy of what the country really needs and wants. I don't know how you build a policy on that. I mean, there's a situation which you can't plan anything. I mean, any actor involved in this.
And ordinary people.
Yeah, ordinary people, but especially the nations that are imperiled. This is awful.
Speaking of the submarines again, Trump have ordered now to relocate them wherever they are relocated, because that's probably a secret information.
Yeah.
But do they know when to stop? Like, obviously they're playing the muscling on each other game, but do they know where to stop? Or like at some point we can see a nuke strike just because somebody's going to feel humiliated? Like, you know what I mean?
This is the
it's funny, and I'm laughing just to hold myself back from like, you know, like, because it's totally the opposite. It's a very like serious matter. Like clearly, like they're muscling each other up with nuke submarines.
What you say shows both the importance and the limits of psychology and politics. You can get an explanation of why they're acting this way, or the indeterminacy of their outlook, or the role that ego will play. But what you can't do with psychological analysis is translate this directly into a policy that takes objective interests outside of those of the leader into account.
Professor Bronner.
Yeah, sorry.
I just want to finalize it with, I'm very concerned about Ukraine, and I'm very like, my heart is torn apart when I'm seeing the missiles and the drones striking Ukraine. I understand that there is no simple solution, but what can we honestly tell the Ukrainians? What should they expect? What should they prep for the next 3.5 years before we can see a new election in the United States. And I'm referring to the election in the United States because I don't see any other major global player that can help.
I think that's true.
Regulate the conflict and the war in Ukraine, between Ukraine and Russia, and just in general that region. I don't think that China is strong enough and has enough leverage, economical, political, to step in and potentially mediate between the sides. Frankly, I don't know if they even care enough. I think that for now, for the feasible future, the only geopolitical player that can step in, either mediate or interfere or do anything in regards to the conflict between Ukraine and Russia and the war and stop it, it's probably only United States that is capable,
and that you can't count on.
And exactly, right, at least for the next 3.5 years. So what should they expect? What how can, what we can portray for them for the next 3.5, just endless drone and missile attacks for the next 3.5 years?
I think that the 2 or 3 things they had that, again, speaking from the outside, right, which is,
of course,
as I said, always easier. First of all, I think they should insist upon a campaign to democratize and to show the world, because Ukraine is sort of sliding out of the public focus compared to Gaza and other issues as well. The government needs to shift the focus back. And I think the way it shifts the focus back is by standing up for what it believes. I think those young people have done more for Ukraine than many of its generals in their protest. So, number one, stand up and demand democracy in Ukraine. Second thing is, I think that, and this is a delicate issue, Ukraine is going to have to, I think, prepare itself to make concessions. That's not easy.
You mean they should create marketing public campaigns from the government towards the public that will have to make concessions?
We'll have to make some. You can debate what. I mean, it seems to be pretty clear that Crimea, that the conquered territories,
that's out of the picture.
It's out of the picture, unless they want to set up an offensive, which at this point is a tremendous gamble. And I'm not sure that the Ukrainian regime has the wherewithal to do that. So that's the second thing. The third thing is it would seem to me that the Ukrainian people must begin to have take a serious view of reconstruction, as you say. And lastly, this is also tough. I think Ukraine needs to expand its range of allies. Talk to the Chinese. Try and split the BRICS alliance in one way or the other. Now that can't be I know that can't be in public, or it probably can't.
Well, why can't that be in public? What's wrong about it if that will be in public?
Okay, here
it's a question.
No, it's legitimate, and I can't really answer it because I don't feel the pulse exactly of the Ukrainian people the way you do. But I would think that this is a crucial political move that needs to be made.
Well, I might be disconnected from them as much as you are. I just have the language opportunity to communicate with them in person. But I that's also one of my questions for them. For instance, that their main economical partner as a country, not as a group of countries like European Union, but as a country to country, their main importing at like number one partner is China. They're trading country to country mostly with China. And that has been historically for many years. Even before the 2013, China was one of the major countries that would purchase a lot of what Ukraine would export. That's one of my questions. Why don't you guys have a better diplomatic relationships with China? During the time of the war, we had periods of time where Ukraine simply haven't had an ambassador being sent to China. Like they had like
it's
just
unbelievable, actually.
Right. And it's like,
I didn't want to put it like that, but you're right. It's actually unbelievable. And here is also a situation where, how should we say, the leadership has to be challenged. If this were, I don't know, a Richelieu, Bismarck, one of the great figures, George Marshall, one of the great figures in foreign affairs, if you were doing the diplomacy, that the first thing you would want to do is split apart two authoritarian allies, especially if you're doing business with one of them, and you might be able to get even military aid. It's possible.
Well, they're not getting military aid, but they are purchasing a lot of part of the components that they're using for the drones. 40% of the drone that is being constructed and built in Ukraine, it's from Chinese supplies.
Okay,
they're purchasing it, but it's like it's clearly in practice there, but nobody's just doing it like officially and organizing the diplomatic route, if that makes sense.
That's basically what I'm suggesting.
And it's a big question. Why? Like, what's holding you back?
This I don't really. I mean, other than that, your regime, or the Ukrainian regime, believes this will anger or upset the West. I don't know. I don't have an answer for that. I don't know whether it's there. I mean, I don't think this is just pure incompetence. But if it is a question of fearing to anger the West, I think we need a bit more boldness on the part of
and I think they can take a lesson or two from Israel, because Israel picked up a policy of like, we rather get grievances letter from our Western allies rather than have to put people into grades.
Yeah.
And this is something that Ukraine can do too. Like if the price to either stabilize the situation on the front line or potentially even coming to some sort of a solution in that war will be to get the West angry, well, get the West angry and save lives.
Yeah, that's the primary issue has got to be that the government recognizes that its interest is not primary. What's primary is what benefits
the nation.
Yeah,
absolutely. And Professor Bronner, yeah, go ahead, finish that.
No, I was just going to say, this is the key, I think, to all progressive and all democratic policy.
I 100% agree. And I think, and I hope that whatever we can discuss and whatever conclusions we're coming to, similar conclusion and similar discussions should be held and hosted also between the people who can actually influence the situation. Indeed. Professor Bronner, thank you so much for your time. It's always a pleasure.
My pleasure indeed. I look forward to doing it again.
For the next time. Thank you.